General Dwight D. Eisenhower once said, "The battle for France was decided amongst the bloody orchards and hedgerows of Normandy." He wasn't wrong. In this video, we'll follow the story of just one unit on one day as they battle through the infamous Bocage outside the city of Saint-Lô. This is the story of the hell in the hedgerows. Despite the initial successes of the Allied landings along Normandy's coastline on D-Day in 1944, by early July the advance was slowing down. The Cotentin Peninsula and the port of Cherbourg had been secured by US forces, but the Germans were defending fiercely, holding the Americans north of the city of Saint-Lô and repelling British and Canadian advances as they fought to capture Caen. The front line had reached a precarious stability, setting the stage for a meticulously planned offensive in early July in hopes of breaking the deadlock. By the start of that second month of combat, the Allies had one major ace to play: manpower. Ever since D-Day, troops and equipment had been flooding into Normandy to join the fight, stretching the severely limited Germans ever thinner. By the 5th of July, right here on the now peaceful Omaha beach, men of the US 35th Division, National Guardsmen hailing from the state of Kansas, were heading ashore to begin their war in Europe. Led by the 134th Infantry Regiment under their commander, 34-year-old Colonel Butler Miltonberger, they quickly organised a march off to their assembly area some 7 miles inland at Colombières. Their task was to reinforce the front line and link up with the 29th and 30th Infantry Divisions as they began the gruelling assault on the city of Saint-Lô. Facing them across the battlefields would be these men, elements of the formidable 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, Kampfgruppe Heinz, and remnants of the 352nd who had held Omaha Beach on D-Day. These battle-hardened defenders, stretched as they were, also had an ace to play: the terrain. But just why was the Bocage so deadly? And how did the defenders use it to their advantage? The entire region around Saint-Lô was crisscrossed by an intricate network of massive ancient hedgerows dividing the land into a patchwork of small fields. These hedgerows, consisting of substantial banks of earth and rock covered in thick vegetation, proved to be formidable obstacles for armour and infantry alike. At the base they could be as much as 5 feet in depth and some over 7 feet tall, providing an impassable obstacle for men and machines. With minimal effort, each hedgerow could be turned into its own miniature fortress, providing cover from all but the heaviest of shell fire and an ideal position from which to ambush advancing troops. As we see here, Bocage still survives in the area around Saint-Lô today, but less so than it did in 1944, with a little over 1/3 having been lost since that time. By early July, those US units who'd been on the front line for some time had finally, after many costly lessons, begun to learn just how to defeat a determined enemy in Bocage country. Let's take a look. Firstly, from a defender's point of view, Bocage was ideal. Every field offered its own opportunity. Typically, the Germans would sight machine guns at the far corners of each field with arcs of fire set to cross in the centre, often particularly targeting the single field entrance as a natural direction of approach. The lanes around each field were also perfect for moving men from location to location in relative safety. And when backed up with snipers, riflemen, Panzerfaust and mortar teams, every patch of ground became a true defensive killing zone. The Americans had learned this the hard way throughout June, but by July had devised new tactics. Instead of entering fields from the existing approaches, tanks, including adapted Shermans known as Rhino tanks with welded tusk-like steel prongs, would be used to either gouge out an opening in a hedgerow bank at an unexpected location or to create a space into which explosives could be placed. Then, under cover of smoke to blind the defenders, mortar and machine gun fire aimed at the field corners, a breach would be made through which armour and infantry would knock out the remaining enemy defenders. It was costly and terrifying for an attacker who had no idea if a position was occupied until gunfire erupted from the hedgerows. And with as many as 20 such fields to every single mile, it was also utterly exhausting. It was then at 8:30 p.m. on the 13th of July that orders came for the 35th to move up to the front lines in preparation for an attack that was scheduled to commence at 5:15 in 2 days' time. Moving into this area throughout the night of the 13th and into the early hours of the following day, they replaced a regiment of the exhausted 29th Division in the line. The handover included an ominous warning from an intelligence officer of the 115th Infantry Regiment. Now keep your heads down, the Germans are behind that next hedgerow. Further adding that they had attacked towards the Germans on 3 separate occasions and always ended up back at their original jump-off point. Settling down into newly vacated foxholes, the men of the 134th Infantry Regiment quickly learnt of their objective, the first they had been issued in the Second World War. It was brutal in its simplicity. Obliterate enemy forces north of Saint-Lô and capture the vital Hill 122 overlooking the city. The overall plan to capture Saint-Lô had actually been launched on the 11th of July on a 3-divisional front, with the 2nd Division tasked to capture the strongly held Hill 192 and approach Saint-Lô from the east. The men of the 29th Division were to assault in the centre via the village of Saint-André and along the vital Martinville Ridge, and the 35th to their right, who would attack through La Carillon and up to Hill 122, a prominent plateau overlooking Saint-Lô. If that could happen, one of the key German defensive positions in the entire region would fall. Zooming into the map now, we can see that by the 14th of July, the men of the 134th, who had been in reserve when the main assault was launched on the 11th, were now moving up to take their place in the line. The section of line assigned to the regiment was right here, running from just south of the village of Villers-Fossard, across this strip of Bocage countryside, up to the top of Hill 122, some 2,500 yards away, with the 1st and 2nd Battalions in position side by side and the 3rd in reserve. Let's take a closer look at the 1st. With 2 companies in the lead, A on the left and C on the right, with B and D further back in support, they would leave this exact hedgerow under cover of artillery fire at 5:15 a.m. on the 15th of July and begin their advance. Moving some 500 yards down a gentle slope towards a small stream, they would take hedgerow after hedgerow before beginning the climb through the hamlet of Émilie and onto the slopes of their objective, Hill 122. A very tough proposition, especially for a completely raw unit. By 7 p.m. on the 14th, battalion commanders gathered for a critical meeting. Here they received detailed information about the coming artillery barrage with both 105 and 155mm pieces due to saturate the enemy position immediately in front of the main line of advance. This barrage, coupled with mortars creating a massive smokescreen, was hoped to cover the attackers in their assault. For those meant to be leading the way, it was an incredibly nervous time. Moving up to their departure line in the early hours of the 15th, the 1st Battalion men settled down in the quiet before the storm. Many men in the preceding hours had given their personal effects to friends behind the line. Now they waited, checked their weapons and ammunition over and over again, wrote a quick few words in a letter they hoped to send home, or some simply prayed. At exactly 5:15 a.m, a distant rumble quickly escalated into the thunderous roar of high explosive shells as the planned barrage slammed into the enemy front line some 300 yards ahead. Under that cover, each man rose, gripped his weapon, and began to advance towards the enemy line. Just moments later, the leading platoons of Captain McGowan's Company A came under heavy mortar and artillery fire, accompanied by the sounds of enemy machine guns as the defenders opened up. To considerable surprise, German soldiers were seen emerging from their own hedgerow and advancing over open ground towards them. It seemed the enemy were launching their own attack at exactly the same time, and the 2 formations smashed into each other, exchanging fire at incredibly short range. In a fight that lasted only minutes, the Americans held their ground and the surviving Germans scrambled back over the hedgerow to return to the defensive. As the men of A and C Company struggled to their feet, leaving many comrades in the meadow unable to rise, they began to advance once again. Crashing into the nearest hedgerow, they cleared the remaining enemy at the point of the bayonet in vicious hand-to-hand fighting, with rifles, pistols, grenades, and even knives being used in the fight. Momentum was everything. Pushing on all the time, and under an increasing enemy barrage, they cleared hedgerow after hedgerow, crossing the stream ahead of them, driving the enemy before their advance. It was extremely hard on the nerves of the men, as one American officer recalled.
The area was merely a succession of small enclosed pastures with a few orchards, likewise enclosed by hedgerows. Seldom could one see clearly between the confine of the field. It was difficult to keep physical contact with adjacent squads, platoons, or larger units. It was difficult to determine exactly where one was. Unlike conditions in open country, flanks could not be protected by fields of fire. All these contributed to the difficulties of control and caused a feeling of isolation on the parts of small units. All this meant that the frontline troops, through their neighbors, were nowhere around. They could not see them. They were not in the adjacent field. Often this feeling of being out on a limb would cause the leading elements to halt and wait for the flank units to come up, and sometimes these were actually ahead.
Nevertheless, by 6:30 a.m, the men of Company C had reached this hedge line and finally drew breath. With none of Company A in sight to the left, they assessed their losses. In a little over an hour, Company C had crossed some 800 yards of Bocage, losing 60% of their men in the process. Back at battalion headquarters, by now the first wounded were coming in, but no real information could be gained, all communication lines having been severed by the enemy bombardment, and so Major Wood, the 1st Battalion XO, was sent forward to ascertain the situation. Finding Captain Davis and the 52 survivors of Company C reorganising just here, he arranged for Company B to come up and take over the assault on the right. Company C, though, weren't the only men to have suffered badly. The mortar and machine gun crews had been heavily hit too, with one machine gun team down to a single private soldier. Finally, at 7:30, Company A on the left were located, some 200 yards behind and to the left of the C Company line. With heavy resistance to their front, Captain McGowan had put in a request for tank support to breach the hedgerows ahead. Within a short time, a platoon of Shermans came up, and Company A, now seeing an opportunity, instead began to move left in an attempt to outflank the enemy. Advancing along this hedge line, they were in position by 9 a.m, about the same time that Company B arrived to take over from the battered Company C men. Just a few minutes later, with Company A launching their unexpected attack from the left, the advance restarted. Driving forwards from this location, Company B now took the lead, methodically clearing the enemy lines as they practiced just days ago. With machine guns in each corner of the field, they would fire at the opposite corner whilst mortars dropped on the far hedgerow. Under that fire, the infantry squads would advance along each side, often at a crawl towards the enemy positions. Amongst those leading men was Nebraska native Sergeant Freddie Sorensen, who single-handedly silenced a German machine gun with a well-placed grenade. He was one of many men who wouldn't live to see nightfall. With tanks now providing close support to Company A on the left, communication with tanks became a real problem. With no radio contact, it was down to men to jump on a tank, bang on the hatch until it opened, and then point out targets, often only a handful of yards away. But the Company A attack was working. As they continued onwards at a slight oblique, they managed to work behind the Germans, still firing on Company B, and appearing through a hedge behind the defenders, took 38 prisoners in short succession. With their front now clear, Captain Francis Mason's Company B could also push on. It was now that those men encountered another menace on the battlefield, one which plagued GIs throughout the entire war: mines. With this sunken lane in the Company B sector running directly through the landscape and towards Hill 122, it was tempting for the Green soldiers to use it as an easy and fast route of advance. Before long, it was realised that the Germans too had considered this, and bursts of fire were seen whipping along the lane. Rushing for cover, men left the central part and moved closer to the banks, only to be deafened by nearby explosions as men left and right were badly wounded or killed. The enemy had seeded the banks with anti-personnel mines, knowing that the fire would drive the Americans to exactly that spot. Unable to locate those mines in the thick undergrowth and losing men all the time, the advance slowed to a crawl, and the lane was eventually abandoned in favour of the equally deadly assault through the hedgerows. Eventually though, progress was made, with Captain Mason's men joining up with Company A to form a continuous front for the first time that morning, just short of the village of Emily. Here the men paused, reorganised and prepared to launch one final push towards their main objective, some 600 yards away. That assault came at 12:50. By now, according to surviving records, the shock of battle for new soldiers had worn off, and leaders, sometimes officers, sometimes sergeants, and sometimes privates, were coming to the fore. The fear of the hedgerows, much talked about in the days before the attack, had also now lost its hold, and men were beginning to work together as they systematically advanced. Each pocket of resistance encountered was outflanked or suppressed and destroyed, with men taking the ammunition from their fallen comrades on the field to continue the advance. Despite the mounting losses, 1, 2, or more every time the men emerged from one hedgerow to assault another, the attack went on. By now though, all units had lost considerable numbers. Amongst the machine gun and mortar men, 70% lay dead or wounded. Company D, nominally in reserve but fed into the fight piecemeal throughout the morning, had lost 6 of its 8 officers, but still the attack went on. By 1 PM, the collection of shattered houses which had once been the village of Emily was captured, and Company B, advancing ahead, climbed the slopes of Hill 122, only to be thrown back by heavy machine gun fire just yards short of its summit. Low on numbers, exhausted, and with their heavy weapons support decimated, the men of the 1st Battalion finally formed a defensive position between Emily and the crest of Hill 122 to await the inevitable counterattack. It came in several waves that afternoon, with men in foxholes, hedgerows and behind trees pouring fire into the advancing enemy, finally repulsing them at the point of the bayonet. At 9:50 PM, with the last of their strength, Company B moved forward once more. Again they approached the crest, and again they were pushed back, leaving many of their friends strewn across the lower slopes of Hill 122. The final act of an utterly exhausting fight for a battalion which had gone from green to veteran in a single day was to take place at 11:05 PM, when A and B companies rose one more time and advanced to the crest of Hill 122. Clearing the enemy along the way, the men dug in as best they could. They'd far outstripped their comrades in the 2nd and 3rd Battalions, advancing against all odds some 2,300 yards through some of the toughest terrain of the entire Second World War. Dawn the next morning brought unwelcome news. The crest, which the day before seemed to have been reached, was still partially in German hands, and that vital view down into Saint-Lô still belonged to the enemy. It would take 3 more bloody days of fighting before the Germans were pushed from the summit and the men of the 134th could finally look down on the city whose capture had cost so many lives. But those losses were not in vain. Eventually Saint-Lô did fall, and in the coming days, weeks and months, the fight would move on, eventually ending with the liberation of Normandy, France, and the end of World War II in Europe. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, why not check out our other documentaries right here on YouTube covering well-known actions of the Second World War. We love making videos like these, and we simply couldn't do so without the support we receive from our great community of YouTube members and our patrons. If you'd like to support us in what we do, please check them out at the link below. That's all this time. Thanks again, and we'll see you soon.